The Think website mentions inquiry as one of the pillars of education. So what do you mean by it?
Okay, one way of answering that question is to say inquiry begins with a question whose answer we don't know yet and we want to find out. And then you do certain things, you think on your own, you observe, and then come up with an answer and a conclusion. That's a kind of brief outline of the process of inquiry. And the outcome of inquiry is knowledge. So does that make sense? This is very different from exam questions. In exam questions, what happens is you already know the answer. Right? So when I ask you what's the molecular structure of a water molecule, I wouldn't ask that question unless I wanted you to repeat what you already know. But an inquiry question is different. Inquiry question is to formulate what you do not know.
So it's a search for an answer, and the search involves looking for the answer yourself, not just, you might find the answer somewhere else, but that's not what you're looking for. Search for an answer through your own thinking, reflection, and reasoning.
So
that's,
to be clear, if I have a question and if I look it up in a book or if I search the web for an answer, even though I am engaged in a quest to find an answer to my question, I am not engaging in inquiry.
If the answer already exists, but the way you put it, it's as though the answer exists somewhere. And if the answer exists somewhere, then it's not inquiry. You're just looking for the answer. It's an existing answer. Here you're starting with a question where the answer doesn't necessarily exist, or you're not satisfied with the answer that exists, and you're searching further on your own. When you say on your own, it doesn't have to be individual, it could be collective.
Yeah.
But it is a seeking by the inquirers where there is no answer.
Yeah. There is also a slight difference. For example, it may be the case that a 10-year-old or a 15-year-old is asking a question whose answer she doesn't know already. But if she goes and asks her teacher for an answer and the teacher gives the answer, that is not inquiry. But on the other hand, the same question, if she figures out an answer on her own, using her own thinking, her own experience, her own observation, without getting it from somewhere else, even if the answer exists out there, for her it would be inquiry. But for humanity it will not be.
Again, if it is simply, the answer is simply a piece of information, then it's not inquiry. Right? It's something that involves thinking through and arriving at an answer rather than just a piece of information.
Yeah.
So asking a question like what would be the weight of this bottle, which I can just measure, that does not constitute as inquiry. That's just measurement.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So, in fact, a similar example would be what's 273 multiplied by 399? I'm sure you don't know the answer. But you can easily find out by calculating. Even a machine can do it. That will not be inquiry because you did not use your mind to engage with that question, think on your own, and come up with an answer. You did some mechanical process.
So, either through counting, measuring, calculating, or imagine there is a myna or a crow that comes to your window every day, and you've really not noticed the color of its beak, and you want to know the answer to that. You observe. You go the next time you see it, you look at it carefully enough to get the answer. But again, it's a piece of information. It's not something that needs a search.
So what to you is the value of such a process of inquiry?
So what you're asking is, why should you inquire?
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
So, well, one answer could be that if you are interested in academic knowledge, then academic knowledge is constructed through inquiry collectively by people who are professional inquirers, researchers. And to understand academic knowledge, if you go through the process of academic inquiry, you have a deeper understanding of what academic knowledge is. So, for example, somebody might tell you that the earth revolves around the sun. You learn that as a piece of information. But when somebody else asks you, why should I believe that? And you look into the reasons for believing that, you understand the evidence and arguments for that position. You have a deeper understanding of that statement. The same thing applies to other beliefs that you get from textbooks and schools. And academic inquiry allows you to have a deeper understanding, a critical understanding of the concepts and statements of academic inquiry. That's one answer. So you become a better learner in school or college if you learn academic knowledge side by side with academic inquiry.
And if you get used to doing that, if you learn if you develop the ability to inquire, all of the different components of inquiring, then it becomes a part of you and you begin to use it everywhere. So, for example, if as a parent you want to know which doctor to go to for your child, you use those inquiry abilities to figure out which doctor to go to. You go to a doctor and the doctor prescribes some medication for your child. You use those abilities, the capacities to figure out whether you really should, whether the doctor's diagnosis is perhaps right. Do you need a second opinion? Should you give your child the medication that the doctor has given? I'm taking one concrete example. Should you give the child the medication that has been prescribed? These are questions that you can at least look for answers for if you have developed the ability to inquire.
Yeah.
So you're transferring those abilities now from the academic domain to the personal domain. And the same way you can transfer those abilities depending on whether it's a professional domain or a public domain. They come in handy in all of those.
So this is a central characteristic of academic inquiry, doubting and questioning. Outside of academic inquiry, you simply accept whatever other people say. So if the doctor says, your 6-month-old child needs Phenergan, so give Phenergan. And you implicitly, blindly accept what the doctor says. If you have the mindset of inquiry, then you ask, is this going to be harmful? You question the doctor. And you look around and check if there are some harmful effects for the medicine that the doctor has prescribed. You don't trust the doctor. No matter how good the doctor is, you don't trust that doctor because the doctor is a human being.
It's not that you don't trust the doctor, but you don't trust the doctor blindly.
Yeah, blindly, that's right. You might trust the doctor, but not with total certainty.
Yeah, you are skeptical of what the doctor might.
Or you would carefully consider it and
Yes.
You would ask questions of why they think something may work in this particular case, or if, like you said, there are side effects. You may then ask, what can I do to mitigate the effects of these as I am going through this medication?
And if you're not satisfied with the answers, you would go elsewhere. You would know where to go to get answers.
So as we said, one should be skeptical of others, authorities, also skeptical of oneself. One's own beliefs you should doubt. That is what you learn from academic inquiry. So this applies to everything that you do. So deciding who to get married to, deciding who to vote for, deciding which school or university you should go to. You engage in inquiry to make a decision. You don't simply ask somebody, which school should I go to, and then you go to that school. No, you think about it carefully.
Yeah, so in the process of having learned how to do this or developed the abilities in the academic domain, it's in some sense becoming a part of your way of being, and you're taking it into everything that you do and think and say.
Here's my next question then. We learn a lot of things at school. We learn about a lot of things at school. Just like you said that we learn that the earth revolves around the sun, there are several such statements that we learn across subjects and domains. Now, if a child is to engage in inquiry, with each of these questions, it is going to take a significantly longer period for us to come to the same conclusions that we could come to earlier just by believing that somebody else has engaged in this inquiry. So, is it worth that trouble? What is the added value that we get from spending all that time and effort on learning to come to conclusions on our own instead of accepting that there are other people who have gone through this process and then come to these conclusions?
Yeah, that's actually a very important question. One cannot reconstruct all the knowledge that humanity has constructed so far. So there is a huge body of knowledge that you can get from school. You cannot reconstruct the entire thing. But the idea is, if you learn how to inquire using some pieces of that. So take, for example, the Earth going around the Sun, the Earth spinning at a tilted angle, the angle being 23.5, and the Earth revolving not in a circular path or elliptical path. You can question all of those. But if you want to look for evidence, certain parts of the evidence are relatively easy. So what is the evidence to show that the Earth is rotating at an angle of, that's an angle that is tilted to the plane of revolution? That part is relatively easy. But if you ask the question, why should I believe it is 23.5 rather than 20 or 30? That's extremely difficult. It requires lots of quantitative calculations. The same way that it is an ellipse, not a circle, extremely difficult. So you can stop there and say, well, people have come up with a conclusion. I'm not aware of the evidence, but for now I take it as true. I have chosen to not doubt it at this point, but I might doubt it later. So it's a decision that you make. So I don't, for example, understand the reasons or the details of the mathematics and physics that led to the conclusion that E is equal to mc squared. I don't know. But my attitude towards it is, I don't accept it blindly. I'm saying, I'm not at this point capable of engaging with that inquiry. I don't have the background, but I know the nature of that piece of knowledge. That piece of knowledge is still uncertain, but I will go by that for now. So where one insists on working out the reasons and where one says, okay, for now I'll stop there, that's a choice that each of us has to make. And that ability is crucial. Not that you work through everything, that's impossible.
So, something that I would like you to say something about. You said that the nature of knowledge is uncertain.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
That means that there is no belief that I can be completely certain about. So take, for example, even this belief that the Earth revolves around the Sun. I'm reasonably certain that this belief is true because I've looked at the evidence and I cannot think of any way of explaining the observations that I'm familiar with. But am I completely certain? No, because in order to observe the Earth revolving around the Sun, I will have to go outside of the solar system. And the nearest star is 4 light years away. There is no way. So I will say this is a theory that explains the observations. And no theory is a fact. And so I know that if a better theory comes along, I will reject this theory. So far, there is no better theory. So I will accept this. And this theory has stood up for with all the criticisms and for the last at least 300 years after Newton, let's say. So you'll say, I'm pretty much certain, but I could still be wrong. That is the scientific attitude. That combination of confidence, at the same time confidence that is imbued with some degree of uncertainty. That's the heart of science. And that is also true about not just science, but also mathematics and humanities and the entire academic knowledge.
So, practicing inquiry exercises in school is, in your view, not just, not so that we can, understand our whole textbook through the means of inquiry, but as a way to train yourself to think a certain way, such that you become capable of original and independent thought.
That's right.
Such that when you're faced with a problem later, you may be able to figure out a way of solving it. And also from, what you just said, the spirit of inquiry is being uncertain of, I mean, however much you believe something is reasonably accurate or reasonably true, you still leave the room for something better coming along. And engaging in inquiry would help you discover this nature of science, which in the future would be the core of you being a scientist.
Yeah. Not just a scientist, but also a much better learner.
Right.
Because learning stops when you're completely certain. But if you have some degree of uncertainty, then you can learn, you can correct your beliefs. So that sense of fallibility and the humility that goes with it is the most important value of inquiry.
Going back to textbooks, obviously you can't do all of schooling the inquiry way. 2 reasons. 1, you'll never finish. And 2, not everything in textbooks lends itself to inquiry. So if you want to have children inquire without changing the syllabus, for example, you could change the syllabus. That would be a whole different ball game. But given the current syllabi, if you look for those pieces that would lend themselves to being done the inquiry way, that is what I think would help. And that would be enough to create the habit of inquiry, the habits of mind, the mindset for inquiry in the children. And if it's done over years, say 6th grade to say 9th grade, they will develop it very gradually. And once they've developed it over time, it'll stay with them.
Yeah. So you could select, for example, like the heliocentric theory. You could also ask the question, the ancients have said that water is an element. Why should I believe that water is a compound? The ancients have said that air is an element. Why should I believe that air is a mixture? These are some of the important questions. And you can engage with these questions through the modes of academic inquiry, and that will be very useful. But there might be other things where, the question or the issue does not lend itself to that.
And anytime there is just pieces of information, it's not going to lend itself to inquiry.
So if somebody says the capital of France is...
what is the capital of France?
Yeah.
You don't know.
Shimla. Okay, if somebody says capital of Paris, if somebody says capital of France is Paris, you're not going to say, oh, unless I go to Paris, I'm not going to believe it. There's a movie of this kind, in which the hero of the movie doubts everything that is stated. And so he refuses to give air tickets to countries that he has not visited. Yeah, but
How do I know that they exist? How can I, with any confidence, give you a ticket to the place?
Is this an English?
Yeah, an
Hindi
English.
movie.
There's
that
Hindi
you?
Movie called, there's a Hindi movie called Aankhon Dekhi.
That's right, exactly that one. So he goes to the zoo to find out if tigers exist and there are tigers roar and so on. Now, even if this guy goes to France and he's in Paris, how does he know that Paris is the capital? He wouldn't know. So that's not taking it to a ridiculous extent. You can say, well, people have taken Paris as the capital of India. Well, go by that. Or there are questions like, why should I believe that there are 7 days a week? Why should I believe that there are 12 months? These are not inquiry questions. These are, questions of convention, right? And you say, okay, I accept that. Why should I believe that a foot has 12 inches as opposed to 10 inches? You just say that has been the convention. That's okay. You stop there. But you take the serious things, that, for example, the beliefs which have shaped the 21st century worldview. That's important. So things like whether water is an element or not, whether atoms exist and molecules exist, how genes shape human behavior. Those are important questions. Those things you engage with.
There's one other thing to keep in mind when talking about inquiry. When you talk about inquiry in the educational context, a lot of people say, oh, we're doing it already. We do inquiry in whatever we do. And there's a difference between questions which are based where you need to do a little bit of inquiring for yourself and you find the answer by thinking about it yourself. These are isolated pieces. Versus where you're doing inquiry in the activity, but it doesn't have any impact on the way you learn. What we're talking about when we talk about inquiry in this context, in the context of think, is where your very orientation is towards inquiry becoming a part of your being, your way of thinking. And you're developing the ability to do that. So the focus then is not on the knowledge content, but on the abilities, capacities that you develop in the process, which is what you then use in everything else.
So,
And more importantly, the attitudes.
Yeah,
The-
yes, the mindsets,
the
habits
mindset,
of mind,
yeah.
attitudes, predispositions that you develop,
Hmm.
and so on, yes.
so we're saying that we would call only those activities as inquiry, which would develop these abilities and predispositions and
Mhm.
Yes.
habits of mind.
Yeah.
Yes.
And other activities that might involve asking and engaging with a question, but to a limited extent, would not come under what we call inquiry
Yeah.
right now.
So take cases like in laboratories, you have dissection. Does that constitute inquiry? No, dissection is people are giving you some instructions to do certain things. You perform those things. You have no idea why you are doing it, what the purpose is, and so on. You don't realize that this is a methodological strategy. The same thing applies to physics laboratories. You go through certain motions. You don't understand them, why you are doing them, nor do you transfer those things to stuff outside of the laboratory. And as long as you don't do that and you do not learn how to design an experiment, which typically doesn't happen in laboratories, laboratory periods in schools and colleges, then you are not engaged in inquiry.
I have one last question. So we've spoken about inquiry in the school, in the context of the school, and in the context of an education system. But if I'm not a child and I want to learn how to inquire, is that possible?
Yeah, if you are a learner, whether you are 10 years old or 15 years old or 30 years old or 50 years old, doesn't matter. If you're a learner, you can always learn.
And what do you mean by learner?
Learning is a process of a mental change that has an effect on your behavior. So if you change whatever is the contents of your mind on the basis of some activity of this kind, the kinds of examples that we mentioned, and that changes your behavior, that changes your beliefs, that changes your attitudes, etc., through the activity of inquiry, then you have learned something. And that learning is of value to everybody, not simply school students or college students, but also people who are about to retire, people who have already retired, if you are still capable of learning.
Which is why we talk about lifelong learning.
Yeah.
So you're learners, it's possible for you to be a learner till the end of your life.
I have one final question. I mean, we've explored what inquiry is and why we think it is of value to a learner of any age. But how does one go about developing these capacities?
By engaging in questions, you discover questions that you would like to ask. By engaging with those questions and discovering things for yourself or arriving at your own conclusions, that is one. The other is you work in a community of similar, like-minded people. You engage in debates, discussions, and so on. You could also seek the advice or help of people who are experienced inquirers, and you might get a few tips from them. So all these are good. You might engage in reading. Fine.
One of the ways would be ThinQ offers a course called Inquiry and Integration, and it runs for 5 months every year, once a year. That's one place to start if you want to learn how to inquire and become an inquirer.
I guess it's one such community of learners where there is a set of people who are experienced in inquiry who can guide this sort of learning and help you develop these abilities.
Applications open around March, and the course goes from May to October.